So hello everyone. So as Anika said, my name is Lana and I am a master's student at the University of Reading. I'm supervised by Mola Headland, and Highways England are kindly funding my dissertation and my studies, and they've kindly provided some of the lovely pictures throughout the slides that I'm going to show you. Again, as Anika said, I have been and I still am working with pottery from the A14 Cambridge to Huntingdon Improvement Scheme for my dissertation. And I've specifically been looking at how that pottery is sampled and whether the current sampling practice is the best practice. So today I'll be talking to you about my research goals and all the work I've done so far. Essentially, I'm looking at an experimental sampling strategy that employs a purposive method rather than the random methods that's normally employed on larger sites. And I'll be critiquing the strategy to assess whether it's representative of the full population and appropriate for use on sites in the future. So my research question was raised due to limitations in the way that bulk finds are currently processed within commercial units. So as you already know, pottery is one of the most common classes of artifacts recovered from archaeological sites, and it often makes up a large percentage of bulk finds, which is great because it can provide a massive wealth of information and it's a common and valuable resource. However, because of this, there is a lot of pressure on professional units, especially, to process and analyze pottery efficiently and provide the best value for money for their customers. And it's these time and cost restrictions that can really limit the extent of analysis and hinder how well we interpret evidence. So the general idea for the project is to look at assemblages from 3 TEAs, which are targeted excavation areas on the A14, which will be made up of specifically targeted samples. And these will be areas of interest within the TEAs, such as identified kilns or part of industrial or settlement areas. And these will be referred to throughout the project and the presentation as the sampled data. This data will be looked at by 2 specialists that you've already met. So we've got Adam Sutton, who will be covering the Iron Age wares, and Anika will actually be covering the Roman wares. The rest of the assemblage, still coming from within these TAs, will be called the non-sampled data, and that's all the wares that I'm looking at. And then together, that will form the complete data set for the project. The aim is to explore the sampling strategy employed to determine how effective and representative it is. And specifically, I'll be assessing whether the sample data can form an accurate representation of the full data set by comparing the analysis of the 2. If it does, great, successful, the project will illustrate an analytical approach that's more time and financially efficient than current methods. And it should also determine whether the full data set is a worthwhile unit of analysis due to theoretical issues we have with unknown populations. So to fulfill this aim, we've got 4 main objectives from my perspective. So I'll be analysing the non-sample portion of pottery recovered from TEAs 14, 15 and 16 and recording these in the Oracle database. I'll then be using quantitative data generated from Oracle to create comparable visual and statistical representations, and then using these representations to compare the sample data to the full data set and determine if an accurate representation has been produced. Then I'll be comparing and critiquing the sampling strategy in accordance to these results. So why pottery sampling? Why look at sampling at all, and why specifically pottery within that? Well, that's a great question, thank you. And to answer that, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about the ways in which pottery has been studied in the past and the ways that large data projects sample presently. So to understand the specific limitations that professional units can face, it's important to briefly delve into the ways in which pottery has been studied in the past and the development of a discrepancy between how pottery is studied in academic and professional spheres. This is relevant because the project I'm working on relies really heavily on the professional works and experience of Mola Headland and the academic support and resources of the University of Reading. So only touching on this briefly, but in the mid-50s, Shepherd proposed 3 categories of pottery study, which have since had dates assigned to them. And these phases have been broadly critiqued and further elements have been added depending on whose work you're reading. But the general trend has broadly been accepted as in the 16th century, we have pottery vessels being studied as culture objects, with the primary use being to understand past cultures. And then in the 19th century, the primary use shifts towards using pottery as dating evidence through typological studies and assigning it to stratigraphic layers. And then in the 20th century, we again change perspectives. And instead of thinking about what the typologies are simply, we're thinking about why they are changing and emphasizing the study around pottery technologies and context as a way of relating to potters in the past. Of course, this isn't where the development of pottery studies ends. You could also include the focus on pottery to understand economic changes in the later 20th century and more recent shifts towards understanding vessel assemblages and functions to illustrate social identities. But these developments are mostly seen within the academic sphere, which has the privilege of less time restrictions, greater resources, and arguably less financial pressures than the professional sphere, which brings us to the point I was hoping to make. And that's because of the differences in how these two spheres are perceived in general. There's also a discrepancy in what is demanded from them, which often results in professional units being limited to only presenting findings regarding the typological phase of study. Now, this isn't to say that those in the professional sphere don't put forward other kinds of research. There are plenty of key publications that occur outside the academic sphere, but rather that in developer-funded projects, the final outcome is often grey literature, which doesn't facilitate anything more than typological analysis. So simply put, without the benefits of extended time, funding, and resources that some academic authors have, it's very difficult for professional units to fully utilize the wealth of information that ceramic bulk finds may provide. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, simply put, it's sampling. When you sample your data, you end up with less material to analyze and discuss, meaning it takes less time, frees up resources, and reduces the pressure put on professionals. That's great, but how representative can sampling really be? Well, that's what we're hoping to find out in this project. Everyone has their own opinions of sampling bulk finds, and for some, it's the saving grace of massive data projects, and for others, it's the root of all evil that prevents us from truly understanding material culture that's in front of us. But in my opinion, it's just a daunting necessity for major projects, and as a result, it's something that can't be ignored. You've got to understand how sampling works for us to utilize its potential in a way that won't limit our understandings of the data in front of us. So don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with the theory of sampling and the history of sampling strategies and studies. As much as I'm not a huge fan of presenting, I don't want to send you all to sleep before I'm done. So all you really need to know is that while sampling methods are rarely discussed in depth in methodologies, big data projects usually employ random sampling, which ensures an unbiased distribution of data points. However, for our project, we're employing purposive sampling, which involves targeting specific areas of interest to answer unique questions of a site. There have been some criticisms with this approach in the past, particularly in reference to the sustainability of data, meaning if you're targeting your sample areas to answer very specific questions, how are people going to use that data that you've collected in the future to understand a site more generally? Well, that's another aspect of the strategy we hope to explore further. So in the past, purposive sampling has been used in this somewhat unsustainable way, but we hope to utilize a more general sense. So instead of targeting specific areas and hoping that they represent the whole population, we'll be looking at features as whole populations within themselves. And by approaching it this way, the features only have to be representative of themselves. And then combined, the ceramic culture of these areas should be accurately reflected and thus reflect the ceramic culture of the broader site, while still answering the questions that we're putting forward. So a very similar approach has been successful in the past, utilised by investigations of the Town and Country of Roman Britain project, and discussed further by Doherty in the methodological report regarding Roman Essex, which has been a huge contribution to our understanding of this strategy and adaptation for the A14. Of course, there are more general issues with sampling as a concept that we have to face. So for example, you all know pottery that's excavated from an area is already an unintentional sample of a larger death assemblage of a site, which is in turn an unintentional sample of the original life assemblage. So when we sample our excavated populations, we're actually sampling a sample of a sample, which is where this idea of representation gets a bit tricky. So as well as raising issues of how representative purposive sampling can actually be, we should also be considering how representative the whole population of a site really is and how useful it is as a unit of measurement for ceramic culture. Now, it is worth mentioning at this point that the study I'm about to talk to you about is only really applicable to large-scale infrastructure projects that have major quantities of pottery that are just super overwhelming and unworkable. So think HS2 scale. But hopefully it could have a really positive impact on the way that bulk finds are processed in the future. Right, hopefully you're still with me because that was quite an info dump. So now I just want to quickly talk about the targeted excavation areas that the data is coming from. So as I said, I'm covering 3 TEAs, that's TA 14, 15, and 16. So in this image, TA 14 is this sort of isolated area at the top here. And then we have TEA 15 here and TEA 16 right at the bottom. These were selected due to a diversity of Iron Age and Roman activity in the areas, which spans from the late pre-Roman Iron Age into the late Roman period and beyond. And there's also evidence of a large range of actual activities. So we've got settlements, enclosures, kiln sites. There's a lot to look at. So the assemblage we're working with is great size, it's varied in chronology and varied in activities. So briefly going into this in a bit more depth, we've got TA 14, and I'm not sure how easy it is to make out, but the colored dots here on the bottom left of the slide correlate to the dots on the picture itself, and they'll show where pottery is sampled and the period that it associated with. But essentially, we're just looking at Iron Age and Roman wares. So excavations of this TA took place between October 2016 and January 2018, and identified that the main periods of occupation were Iron Age settlements and Roman agricultural and industrial activity. So 2 foci of Iron Age activity, one on the western edge and one to the northeast, indicate settlement activity, particularly through roundhouses and pit groups, whereas the Roman activity, which forms the majority of the archaeology present within this TA, is clearly indicative of a more agricultural purpose. This is particularly the case on the eastern edge of the site, where we can see a lot of intercutting ditches that form field boundaries, which actually produce quite a lot of pottery. But importantly though, 2 kilns were identified within this TA, one in the northeastern edge and one towards the southern central part. But the pottery from these will actually be discussed momentarily. So TA 15 excavations began again in October 2016, but these actually carried on until March of 2018. And the TA produced a lot of evidence of prehistoric activity, which I'm going to skip right over, and some Iron Age and Roman activities, and then some medieval and post-medieval furrows and field boundaries that I will also not be talking about. It appears that TA 15 is actually a continuation of the settlement of TA 14, and this is supported by industrial evidence to the west of the site, including enclosures. A kiln was discovered in the southeast of this enclosure area, which seemingly had pottery deposited within it after it went out of use. Again, the pottery will be discussed momentarily, but generally we're seeing a continuation of not only Iron Age to Roman occupation, but a more geographical continuation of the settlement as a whole, which is pretty cool. And then finally, we have TA 16, which was excavated between November of 2016 and June of 2018. So just like TA 15, there's a huge range of evidence coming from this area, from prehistoric features such as barrows and all the way into Saxon sunken feature buildings and post-medieval field boundaries and drainage ditches. In terms of Roman activity, we're seeing it's mostly condensed to the east of this really nice Bronze-aged barrow right in the middle of the excavation area. And this includes 7 kilns of different types and sizes, but they're mostly figure-8 shapes. And most of the pottery from these appears to be 2nd century in date. So that all sounds great, but how exactly do we plan on using this to achieve our goals? What's tying A to B? So the methods were split into 2 main phases, the first of which is the initial identification of assemblage wares. This stage has already been completed and consisted of me analysing the non-sample data and inputting the results into the Oracle database. Sherds were assessed as hand specimens with a microscope whenever necessary. And we were basically looking at fabrics, forms, sherd counts, weight in grams, estimated vessel equivalents, rim diameters, decorations where applicable. So all of your basic quantification identification bits. Primarily to do so, I was using a bespoke type and fabric series made for the A14, which was standardized across the landscape blocks, making it easier to combat inter-observer error and variation. But additional research was sometimes required. So I was relying on a lot of sources like this tempered Belgic pottery and the National Roman Fabric Reference Collection. So once these factors were identified, they were recorded through the Oracle database using a specific data sheet developed for the A14 improvement scheme. And the database allows an input of a range of variables in a standardized way, which means ease of cross-comparison of different records, that assemblages could be sorted into specific variables, and it allowed that sustainable data collection that I was talking about earlier. As I mentioned, this standardization of all of this is really important, as we found this kind of analysis can be really subjective, and it limits inter-observer variance as codes are used, which are a lot more lumpy than they are splitty. But subjectivity is still an issue in some regards. So I, for one, am apparently very splitty when it comes to white wares, by which I mean I tend to separate very minutely based on color. So I was making a lot of use of our buff, cream and white ware bucket codes. And when we compared this to the sampled wares that Aniko did, we found she was simply using white ware bucket code, which is way more standard. It was a lot more practical for what we were doing. But this may also surprise you. I am not actually a professional when it comes to pottery identification. I've only been working on ceramics for a couple of years now, and pottery has only been a fraction of that time. So the confidence that I have identifying fabrics is quite different to that of Aniko and Adams. So that's where some of the subjectivity would have come in as well. But what I will use this moment to quickly say is that both Aniko and Adam have been fantastic mentors, and my skills and confidence have certainly improved since last summer. So big thank you for that there. But back on track, subjectivity has been combated through these methods, but not eradicated, which is simply not possible. So it's something we have to consider in the next phase. This is the comparison of the sampled results to those of the full dataset. Now, I've only just started this phase, so it's a tad more theoretical than the last. So just bear that in mind as I continue. But the first step has been going through the sampled pottery report that Adam and Aniko have produced to look at quantification, spatial distributions, and the functionality of assemblages to identify the trends and what they're implying. So following that, the comparison of their results to that of mine and the full data set is to assess how accurately the sample is representing the whole population. And to do this, data from Oracle has been used to generate pivot tables and visualizations of the data we've collected, as statistical analysis will be run to determine whether the differences are statistically significant. And based on this, we'll be able to judge whether the sample is representative, to what degree, and also leave room for a critique of the strategy and any recommendations to change it for future use. So this will determine whether the sampling approach is more time and cost efficient, and if so, it can be employed by professional units. So as I said, we've only completed phase 1, and we're currently working on the comparison stage. So unfortunately, I don't have much to show just yet in the way of results, but I have run some initial tests just to show all you lucky people. So the way I'm tackling this massive data set is through looking at a sampled data report that Aniko and Adam have produced and comparing the trends to what I'm finding. So to do that, I've generated 5 main questions that derive from this report that I want to investigate, covering topics such as primary industries, chronologies, and status indicators, things like this. So the aim is to answer these questions through the process of data comparison, and that will hopefully illustrate the reflectiveness of the sample. So looking at my first question on that list, which was, is the prominence of locally driven industry in settlements 3 and 4 accurately reflected? This is an initial comparison which discusses whether the lower Ouse Valley industry in the area is as prominent in the full data set as it is in the sampled ware. Now, the LOV industry is pretty newly discovered within the area, and I know Adam is doing a talk on that tomorrow at 4:20, I believe. So I won't steal his thunder, you'll just have to tune in then to know more. But here I have some visualizations of the fabrics recovered, and I'm actually starting with settlement 4, but you will see why in a moment. This is the sampled data on the left and the full data set is on the right. And it's useful to have these visuals just so we can compare like to like rather than you having to take my word for it. But basically what I did here was look at the fabric category, so reduced wares, oxidized wares, color-coded, all of those kinds of things, just to see what was the most prominent. And that would be the reduced wares, which is this khaki green color. But overall, so far, as you can probably just tell from the charts, it's looking really good. The results are incredibly similar. So if I use the percentages, we know that reduced wares form the vast majority, which is 52% of all diagnostic fabrics in both cases. And that's followed by oxidized with 26% for the sample data and 24% for the full. And then miscellaneous wares, which are like our Shelley and grog wares, which make up 12 and 11% respectively. So once that had been established, I looked into the reduced wares to see what the prominent industries were, which are indeed lower Ouse Valley wares. Now there is an oxidized fabric within this industry, but because I do have limited time, I'm only looking at the reduced wares at the moment. But generally we can see that reduced wares are the majority, and within that, lower Ouse Valley, that's the most prominent industry. Yeah, I think that's where we'll leave this one. So then moving on to settlement 3. Again, we're seeing really similar results in terms of fabric categories. So we have reduced wares making up the majority with 42% and 41% of the sampled and full data sets respectively. Then we have miscellaneous wares making 17% for both, and white wares making 15% and 16%. And then I think we have oxidized making up 14% for both. But looking down at the industry table, we're seeing major spikes on the lower Ouse Valley fabrics, little spike on the far right for Horningsea, which is roughly what we saw for the previous settlement as well. But you will also have noticed there's a big old spike right in the full data set here, which isn't in the sampled. And that actually forms the most prominent industry for the full data set. So this is FSGW, or fine sandy grey wares. Now, this doesn't actually completely undermine the idea of LOV being the most prominent industry, as FSGW is a bucket code. So the jump in prominence here could be accounted for by inter-observer variance, a general preference for bucket codes when a shirt can't be assigned an industry, which isn't that far-fetched considering the relative newness of the industry and how difficult it can be to identify unfamiliar fabrics. This is actually the bit that I analyse, so if I sound a bit defensive, that will be why. And furthermore, of the diagnostic shirts, LOVs still hold the majority, and there's nothing to say that some or even a significant portion of these fine sandy grey ware shirts couldn't actually be lower Ouse Valley, that just weren't quite enough confidence to commit to calling it such a new fabric. But all in all, the broader trend of reduced wares being the majority is accurately reflected, and the prominence of lower Ouse Valley industry can be seen within the diagnostic shirts, even if it's not the most prominent in the full data. So while it's too early to say for sure whether the sampling method has been entirely successful, I would feel confident in saying we're off to a strong start, but we're not stopping here. I'm not just making pretty graphs and calling it a day. I am also running statistical analysis just to see if there's any statistical significance to these results. So for the fabrics, again, I've only had time to look at settlement 3 as I'm on quite limited time. but I've ran a goodness of fit chi-square test thus far, basically comparing the sample data to the full data set, which acts as a theoretical model. Now, the test did actually indicate the sample data significantly diverges from the expected results based on the full data set. But again, I can't emphasize enough, this is still very early days. And by running the test on sherd counts and weights, we did highlight some of the things throwing off our data, such as amphora, where you only need a small divergence from the norm in terms of sherd counts to wildly throw out the weight count. So that's pretty much the next step. It's not just running these statistical comparisons, but also investigating what wares are causing the variances and trying to understand why, and through that, to what extent they are actually reflecting major discrepancies. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening. And I suppose I'll be ready to take any of your questions.